So now, like I said, we're kind of at that point where we've done some good sculpting here. And it's not to say we won't necessarily come back and maybe do a little more sculpting on the rest of this. But I figured it'd be a good call to kind of get you guys to see some sculpting on the gear, right? A lot of natural, great reinforcement of stuff, some of the stuff we've already been doing here. And it'll kind of let me kind of explore the stroke with you a little bit more. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to 4, right, for object mode, right? So 4 for object mode. Remember, right up here, kind of in the top left corner, right, there's the object mode area. 4 is the quickie for object mode, right? It's been one of our shortcut key quizzes. You'll notice a couple down, though, is sculpt mode, which is 5, right? And that's, of course, on our quiz today. So sculpt mode 5, right? There is a quick key for sculpt mode. In this case, I did want to go back to the object level, 4. That way I can go and I could switch, turn my crab on, right, and click on the crab body. Now you can use Shift-I if you want to. Shift-I is actually your isolate select. Kind of toggles it, right? It's kind of a cool thing to know about. In this case, though, I think I'll just kind of use the outliner and the visibility controls. Remember, your outliner is right up here at the top right corner. It's really basically it's a list of your objects in your scene. And they have these little eyeballs that can control the visibility, right? And I know I've talked about that tons, and it's in a bunch of videos. Never hurts to reinforce it, though. All right, remember, F is for frame selection. F for frame selection, that's useful, right? Even if you've got orbit on selection on, I still find frame selection, particularly when I'm doing modeling or UV wrapping, I still find that actually fairly useful, right? I love having both on, the orbit selection and the other stuff. All right, so at this point, of course, what we need is multi-resolution on this, right? Because at this point, it's already UV unwrapped, right? If I go to UV editing, you'll see there's the UVs for it, right? We've already UV unwrapped it. Remember, the workspaces, right? Sculpting has its own workspace. All right, and so what ends up happening is, 4 for object. Remember the blue wrench right here, right? We've seen this blue wrench plenty. It's right here. It's kind of slightly below halfway down, these little kind of tabs in the properties menu. Blue wrench, right? Just the blue wrench itself. It's kind of in the blue areas, right? There's a couple of blue buttons there. These are your modifiers, right? So we go to Add Modifier panel up here, and we find Multi-Resolution. Like I said, if you have a smaller screen, you might kind of not see everything here available. So you might have to go down to the bottom, right? Kind of usually where there's a little triangle kind of pointing down. And if you just leave your cursor there, it'll kind of scroll down automatically without having to use a scroll wheel. But you want to find multi-resolution, right? Multi-resolution. This is what gives us our ability to do high-resolution sculpting. There we go. And now we see it's here as a modifier. Now, it's not enough to apply that modifier. You actually have to subdivide, right? See there's a button called Subdivide? This is what's going to allow us to actually properly add multiple resolutions. And remember, resolution is just the actual polygon count, right? The more you subdivide, the more polygons you have available. And it's multi-resolution because you can go down the resolutions or up and work fairly non-destructively at the different levels. So I'm going to subdivide. And now we see it's at level 1, right? We've got a little more polygons. Remember, if you go to the little V pointing down here for kind of the 2 overlapping circles, you'll see there is a button called Statistics, and that'll turn your actual polygon count stuff on here. It gives you like vertex, edge, face. Kind of useful. Subdivide. Subdivide. And now we're at level 3, about 180,000. I'm going to subdivide one more time. And one more time. Now, my computer could easily handle, getting up to like 10, 15 million for this guy. And actually probably go higher, but I usually never really need much more than that for the kind of detail levels I want. Yours, depending on your device, might start to choke at about 3 million. Push it as far as you can, right? I understand the limitations sometimes of the devices that you're on. So in this case, though, I know I want to have, probably above 1 million to be able to do some of the detailing I want to, right? So now we've got the multi-resolution on. We've got a lot more geometry, right? Remember, Alt-left mouse button rotates your camera, of course. Alt-middle moves. Alt-right zooms, right? Alt-right mouse button zooms. And what I want to do is I want to go to sculpt mode, right? 5, right? That's our quiz today. 5 for sculpt mode. right? So I hit 5, and now we're in sculpt mode. All my sculpt brushes are back up, right? We can see my radius for the size of the brush, as well as the strength, which is the amount it's going to pull out or push in is there. And you see now we have things like our textures, so we can load textures in, our stroke, right? Even some other brush properties, some of which we'll go over later on our second project. So now we have this on. Now remember though, whenever you turn on any shaping tool, right, whether it's your tweak tool, your move, rotate, or scale, or your sculpting brushes, you'll notice that these kind of up here at the top become available. And in fact, you'll see kind of an icon that looks like a butterfly, kind of with a line down the center. And you'll see X, Y, and Z. This allows you to turn symmetry on for your sculpting. So see how your brush now shows up on both sides? So there's kind of a blue dot on both sides. So remember, mirror will not work with multi-resolution. So you have to have your mirror modifier applied. That does mean you lose the ability to extrude, to loop cut, right, to do those things. But at least with this on right up here, your actual symmetry on, you can at least get shape changing, whether it's sculpting or your more conventional shape changing tools like move, rotate, scale, tweak. These can actually use symmetry without mirror being on, right? So you don't get all the functionality you want from your mirror stuff, but you will get some of it, right? At least your shaping part is available when you turn this on. But remember, it's important to turn that on specifically if you want there to be symmetry, which for us we do on this model, because it's our first model. So I've got that symmetry on. And one of the things, of course, we could do, we saw the other day, was, of course, left-click sculpts, right? So if I hold down left mouse button, it'll pull out the shape. In this case, I've got an image attached. If you need to turn that off, go to Texture, right? See there's a little texture menu up here. And you'll notice there's a texture on. You'll notice there's also a little X right over here, right? Can you move your cursor over a little bit? There's a little X right there. If I click on that, the texture is no longer applied to this. It's still available, right? So you'll see how if you click on kind of the little checkerboard pull-down menu, it's still there. You haven't gotten rid of it. It's just not on. Also, we noticed my stroke was set to anchored, which was kind of cool for what we were doing the other day, but if I want to do regular sculpting, we go back to stroke, and we switch back to space, right? And then you'll see that this just does, left-click sculpt. So I can just kind of sculpt out a little bit here, right? So I just pull that out a little bit. Remember, Control will inverse, right? So if you hold down Control, it'll kind of push in instead of out. And of course, Shift will smooth. You see how it kind of softens it slowly as we go. So we can kind of soften the edges, kind of fade them more if we need to. That's if you wanted to do some of that stuff with just a regular draw right here. Remember, one of the things I also do is I usually kind of turn my brush on, and I go to the wrench screwdriver that's the very top, right, of the properties menu. It's a white wrench and screwdriver. And you'll see in the strength area, there's kind of these two brushes. They're next to kind of the what kind of looks like a pen and a bullseye, right? Circle and a pen. That's your pressure, strength pressure if you have a Wacom tablet. Right next to it is a brush icon. One brush, it's kind of bigger, that kind of is pointing up, and then another like thinner brush for more fine details pointing down. That's unified strength. What that means is that basically all of the brushes use the same strength amount. And I actually usually don't like that for this stuff. So it's cool to have it on if you need it, but I usually make sure to turn it off, right? That way, my draw can be like 2.78 strength, 0.278, and my smooth could be even lower than that, right? And you see that the draw sharp can be at like almost 1, right? So increase kind of, so they get their own independent controls. And that's useful, right? Remember, Shift will smooth, which softens, kind of it has the effect of trying to de-wrinkle or soften the area around it, kind of blend it better, fade it, if you will. Very useful for that kind of stuff, and you'll use that stuff often. I'm going to undo a couple steps just because I didn't really want to do that kind of sculpting there. But I figure it never hurts to talk about it again, right? What I wanted to do is I wanted to explore again some of the strength stuff, right? So in this case, I could go to, say, my draw sharp, right? It's the second brush down. It's automatically set to negative, so it pushes in instead of pulling out, right? And if I go to stroke, right, stroke right here, you'll see there's a stroke method at the very, very top, right? We talked about this before. If you click on that, there's one called line. Remember how we kind of use this for our, kind of little nice sharp creases kind of on the outer shell on our crab? Well, we might want the same kind of thing on this. So like I said, really this video is kind of just great reinforcement of a lot of the stuff we've already done, but on the gear, right, our crab's armor. So stroke method, right? Stroke menu, method, pick line. Remember your brush size is right and left bracket, right? Those are some great quickies for it. It's right here though too. And of course what I can do is in here, I could go in here and I can just left click drag. And you see how it starts to draw kind of a line for me, right? So the nice thing is you can just kind of click and drag and it drags a line, and when you let go, it makes that. So if you want to do some straight lines, whether it's sculpting or painting color, line stroke method is really, really cool for that. You left click and then drag, and you see how it's kind of dragging this line out, and then when you let go, that's where it does it, and it only does it for kind of the length of what you're doing it for. So this is a very, very neat stroke feature, and it works great in Blender actually. A lot of packages don't really have as good a function for this. Blender does. Super easy to turn on and use. There we go. We just kind of put these nice kind of little kind of crease lines in here. If you get a little bit of that, you might need more polygons, but we're trying to show the tools off and not break a computer, right? So basically just kind of getting in here, just doing some nice line sculpting, right? So this is just draw sharp, right? And we've set our stroke to line. And it's going to allow us to kind of do this cool little kind of bit of detailing here very easily, right? Now, obviously, you can see this is not really appropriate for a lot of the part of the crab creature, but it might be kind of at the ridge of the shell, at the ridge of this gear, right? Usually, you're going to use the line brush on hard surface things, or at least non-organic things, because sometimes you have non-organic, like clothing or gear. It's not exactly hard surface, right? It's still a soft surface, but it's not a character or creature, right? So keep in mind you use what's appropriate for what you're working on, but you know, we found some good places that we could use it on the crab creature shell and on this gear as well. But it's great because it gets to show you you've got these really cool strokes in Blender that are super useful for doing all kinds of cool details, right? And that was quite easy to do, just right, and just made these nice lines. So remember, you've got these great strokes in there that can be used, right? Now I'm going to set my things back to space. I might want to do a little bit of image-based detailing on this, right? Depending on what kind of image-based detailing, we're not really going to deal with stencils that much on this project here. We'll deal with it more on our next project, right? Focus on just getting you guys to use some basic regular space and textures, but in this case, you know, I've got my stroke set back to space, which is a good default, right? That's usually what I have on for this stuff is space. It's kind of your good default. It makes your brush behave more like you expect it to. So I usually have space as kind of my default, and then when I need a dot or a line or anchored, I'll take advantage of that. So I want to add a texture. In this case, though, I want to use a different one, right? That way I can just show you guys how to load a texture in again. So remember, we go to the kind of red checkerboard at the very bottom here, right? It's the very bottom of our properties menu list here, the red checkerboard, right? The red checkerboard. When I click on that, it brings up a very empty property, right? Right. Basically up here, it's got a button that says New, right? A button that says New. So I'm going to click on New, right? And it brings this up. And now what we could do is we could either open, if we want to find a texture. In this case, we do, so I'll hit Open. And what we could do is we can go Browse Textures. And you see I've got a simple kind of couple of textures downloaded on this device. It's not my texture lab at home, which is like easily probably 1,000 plus textures. But you'll see that there are regular images that we could use, but there's also these kind of stencils. And I think this time I'm going to use freckles, right? So I'll hit open image. And now that image is loaded in here, right? That image is loaded in. If need be, right, we can always go in here and click on new texture to add another one. But now if I go up to the texture menu here, and I click on kind of the little, right, that little checkerboard, right, you'll see there's two options available. So the nice thing is once you've loaded a texture into the scene, it will be saved with the scene, right? So you'll see that now they're both available for this scene. So you don't have to reload them in every time you open your scene up again, right? You just pick which one you want to use. In this case, I want to use that one. Now, the other thing that's important in textured is mapping type. Tiled will just repeat this over kind of the whole viewport. In this case, I want Viewplane. So you see how mapping has kind of its own options. My favorites are Viewplane and the very bottom one, Stencil. But we're not really going to get into stencils in this project, right? We'll show it a lot more on our more advanced kind of troll biped creature we're going to make for our next project. Our more advanced character creature. So eventually we will see stencils this semester, just not right now. So Viewplane, though, is a good one. That basically is just going to attach it to the brush, and the brush basically paints it, and then it paints it again, paints it again. So it's kind of like every time you place your brush, it'll drop this image on the polygons, and then as you move your brush, it'll drop it again, it'll drop it again, it'll drop it again, right? That's what Viewplane allows. Now, if you go to stroke, space is going to do it like kind of like normal, where it will just paint, right? And it'll drop, 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 right? You can control the spacing for those drops, though. So when you're using space in Viewplane, you want to think about it like it's continually stamping, right? Everybody ever use like a rubber stamp, right? You put in ink and then you stamp it down on something. Well, you can keep stamping it, right? You can kind of stamp in another place on the paper, stamp in another place. Spacing controls how close the spacing is, right? How close the stamps are to each other. So you have to think about Viewplane with space stroke method on as just repeatedly stamping this image on the model as you move your brush. And how much space in the spacing slider, which is kind of right up the top here, right below the method, that's how close it is. So if I was to say set spacing to maybe 20% instead of 5%, you'll now see when I go in here and sculpt, they're not quite as close. Now in this case, I've got it on draw sharp, so I might actually want to switch to my regular draw. Make sure the texture's on, right? There we go. Stroke. And let's turn that spacing up even higher. Let's say set it to 30%. And the strength's already lower. And you see how they're not quite as close on top of each other? So believe it or not, as you play with this and you make sure you got like the texture, I could say, hey, let's set the spacing even higher. Let's go to 60%. Maybe make my strength a little higher as well. And you see how there's more space between the stamps? So you can see more clearly as we play with the spacing here. And let's go to 100% just to show it. What's really happening when you have space stroke on with Viewplane mapping, right? As part of the texture. Now you'll see that, look at that. See, there's actually clearly a distance between them now because the spacing is too high. So that's what spacing controls. I think 60% was actually pretty good for this. So if you want a bit more space so that those images aren't going right on top of each other, stroke has that, spacing. And that just gives you a little more space as you want to kind of sculpt this form in. And I'm going to leave a little bit of it open at the corners here because I want to put some rivets on there. But you see right now, even though stencils are great, I actually love stencils myself. I use them more than the stamping we're seeing here now. It's still great to see how to use this because there's going to be times when this is the cool one, right? When you want kind of stamping. And it's cool because it gives us kind of our first foray into, you know, kind of how to use an image to texture stuff, right? So remember, you have to go to the red checkerboard, right, to load your texture in. Once it's loaded in, the texture menu up here at the top will let you browse between the ones you want to use. And of course, if we want to, I could switch, and then I could switch my stroke method to say something like anchored. Remember, anchored we saw the other day is the one where you can just left-click drag, right? So whereas space will just let you paint, right? You just move your brush and just stamps it, stamps it, stamps it, stamps it, stamps it. And how much spacing you have kind of determines how close the stamps are. This one is all about kind of placing one stamp, right? So we'll see how we're just placing the image once. But if you drag left or right, it makes it bigger or smaller. If you drag up or down, it rotates it. And so you can easily just come in here and do stuff like that. Now in this case, I didn't really want to do that here. But we did show anchored in the last video, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to show it to you guys again here. What I want to do, though, is I want to turn the texture off. So I'm going to go back to texture, hit the X to kind of... Remember, they're still available. They're just not on. Viewplane's always a good one to have for that. I'm going to switch stroke to dragdot. So see how stroke has dragdot? I kind of teased this a little bit last week. There is a stroke method called dragdot. Now, what's really cool is we could use this without an image. You can use this with an image. So if you actually wanted to drag dot those textures, you could. So basically, texture can be applied with every stroke, right? But in this case, I don't want that because I just want a clean rivet shape, right, or button shape. So what I can do is just make sure drag dot's on in my stroke, right? It's one of the stroke options. You can actually go to the brush menu, right? Because there's just these handful of brushes up here, brush menu. And you'll see in the brush menu there is a slider called hardness, right? Just like the crease brush has pinchiness, if you will, there's one called hardness, so it'll harden kind of the edges of the brush, right? So if I turn that up to like a higher number, not quite 1, but closer to 1, and then maybe I turn my strength up for this, make my brush a little smaller, right? Right and left bracket keys. You'll now notice what I can do with drag dot is you see how I can actually drag a rivet. Now, to make it look reasonably good, you're going to need to probably have a million plus polygons. But you'll notice hardness, right? If I turn that down, see that's a much softer drag dot? So that's what hardness is controlling, right? Get it back up to right about there. And of course, drag dot is what's doing this. Because if I set it to space, it's just going to do this, right? Because the spacing's kind of higher on that, right? So drag dot distinctly gives us a cool, neat way to kind of put buttons or rivets on something, right? You just left-click drag, and it drags just basically whatever the texture is. In this case, it doesn't have one, but it's a brush with a sculpt amount, so it's pulling out, and hardness, right? So this is cool because it lets us kind of see some neat little extra options, right? So drag dot really gives us the ability to kind of add these cool little rivets or buttons, metal bits, right? Right along the edge of the armor, right? So once again, I'm just trying to really get you guys to see the power of strokes, and that you even have some cool controls on your brushes like hardness that in themselves are really cool. Once you actually start to get kind of a handle on the basic functionality of these features, Blender's quite good at this, right? It's pretty good. You see I'm getting a little bit of weird detail on those rivets there just because the polygon count's a little lower. If I had subdivided this one more time, you wouldn't see that. But I'm going to keep it a little lower res for you guys and how we're working. All right. And then, of course, we turn on the eyeball for our other one. Go back to 4 for object mode. And now we have a total of 6 million triangles for my scene, right? So I'll save that. But we now have some cool little line detailing we did with our line stroke. Oh, that's on. We have some cool little rivets because of drag dot and the hardness feature. And we just did some more practice and playing around with our ability to assign textures to brushes and actually sculpt with an image. All right, so I think that'll be a great place to stop.